The trade war between the U.S. and China may have reached its peak after both sides ramped up tariffs against each other. The volatility has upended global trade. The EU Commission says it's open to negotiating with the U.S., but it also pushing for internal market reforms. Meanwhile, U.S. President Donald Trump says he's open to a deal with China.
We need unity. We have a market of 450 million consumers. It's the right time to negotiate with the Americans, but also to work on internal reforms within Europe. I'm thinking of our internal market strategy in particular. We hope to remove a number of barriers and strengthen the European internal market as a substitute for others around the world which are closing in, and where protectionism is becoming the rule internationally.
They can choose not to deal with us, or they can choose to pay it. And that's where we are. We can set the tariff, or we can do it a number of different ways, but that seems to be appropriate. And they can pay it or negotiate it, or they can not pay it. They could just say, we can't do business with them. If they think it's too high, they don't have to do business with us.
For more on this, I am now joined by Ignacio Garcia Bercero from the economic think tank Bruegel in Brussels. Welcome to DW, sir. When you consider, when you consider this trade war between the U.S. and China, do you think the EU could somehow benefit from the feud?
Well, the main benefit that the European Union from the current trade conflict is by showing stability in our policies and by showing a commitment to trade openness and reinforcing our own economy. The more that the United States is acting in a very unpredictable and arbitrary manner, the more that the European Union becomes more stable, more attractive. But that requires, I think, both commitments towards reinforcing the single market and commitment toward negotiating trade agreements with other countries. I think that's the main benefit that we can actually get from the current turbulence due to the very unpredictable U.S. behavior.
U.S. President Trump is optimistic about reaching a trade deal with China at some point. What could a deal between the U.S. and China look like?
Well, it's very difficult to say, because at this point in time, it is true that the conflict has peaked, but has peaked at the level of tariffs, which basically implies almost full decoupling between the two economies. I think that the first thing that should actually happen to create the right context for the discussions would be that both the US and China agree to bring back the tariffs to the level they were before the 2nd of April. Then discussions can start between them, the same way that the US is also discussing with the European Union and others, to see how to try to find a mutually acceptable solution to trade grievances. Now, at this point in time, I think that there are three possible scenarios. One scenario would be an agreement similar to the one that was concluded between the US and China in the first Trump administration. It was basically an agreement by which China committed to buy more products from the United States, more quantities. This is something which is potentially discriminatory for the interests of the European Union and others, and which therefore it is a problem and to be watched out very carefully. Another possible approach would be to look more into China exercising export restraint. Now, clearly, because of the issue of overcapacity, it is important that China exercises export restraint. But if there's any such restraint, it has to be to all countries and not exclusively towards the United States. And I think the more interesting approach is if the United States focuses rather on the structural reforms that China needs to undertake. Reforms to make their economy more reliable on consumption, reforms to also modify their system of support to industry, which is highly distorted. I think it's a third type of scenario, which is the one which is more interesting, and it's the one where the European Union could also play a role.
We have less than half a minute, but I do want to ask you, if the trade war between Washington and Beijing continues, who is likely to blink first?
I really think that at this point in time, it doesn't matter who blinks first. It matters that both sides find a way to de-escalate. And I think that that would be good for China, for the US, and for the world economy.
That's Ignacio Garcia Bercero. Many thanks to you, sir.
Thanks to you.
Well, if there's no winner, then perhaps it's best to end this trade war as soon as possible. David Kleimann is a senior associate at the ODI Europe think tank, and he joins us now. So very good to have you with us. So please tell us, what could a deal between the US and China look like?
Well, thanks for having me in the first place. Well, you know, if history is any lesson, there are sort of three kinds of commitments that Trump was able to extract from China and from the European Union during the first Trump term. And that is, you know, in the first place, things that are happening anyways through market forces, such as increasing purchases of agricultural products or energy products. Things that cannot be possibly implemented in the short term anyways, so such as the vague objective to dismantle all onerous tariff or non-tariff barriers, and a commitment to a longer-term negotiation process. That is to say, what Trump's negotiation partners will try to avoid by all means is to make actual concessions in return for these trade violations that he has advanced.
Now, we know that there are negotiations planned now, certainly between the United States and other nations for about 90 days. I think that's the window. But if the trade war between Washington and Beijing continues, who do you think is likely to blink first?
Well, perhaps it's important to understand just how damaged the past 10 days have left the US president and his trade advisor. That is to say, of course, as you say, there's no winners in trade wars, but it certainly was a really disastrous week for the US president, who has launched an unprecedented experiment on the basis of pure economic illiteracy. And that has left him under tremendous pressure at home from within his own party and within an electorate that is growing impatient, and from abroad. And his space for maneuver has shrunk significantly, with markets punishing him really brutally for his tariff endeavors. So Trump is under tremendous pressure to strike a deal with the Chinese here. What that will look like, or how he will engage with China after offending the Middle Kingdom in the way that he has done remains to be seen. This is not an easy one, and is potentially a dangerous situation for him.
And perhaps as a last question, because as I mentioned, you're senior associate at the ODI Europe think tank. From your perspective, could the EU somehow benefit from this growing feud?
Oh, tremendously, indeed. I mean, Trump is making enemies right and left in the international space these days, and the European Union suddenly, really becomes an array of stability, a trusted partner, someone or a partner that countries can rally around, such as the UK, but also countries in Africa, in Southeast Asia. And the EU is currently on a diplomatic mission to engage with countries to see what can be done, in response to the fallout that they're facing vis-à-vis Trump, and that gives business opportunities, diplomatic opportunities to establish itself as the leader of the free world and the global economic order.
All right. David Kleimann, Senior Associate at the ODI Europe think tank. Thank you so very much.
Thanks for having me.